For more than 5 decades, the name D.B. Cooper has been attached to one of America's strangest unsolved mysteries. A man boarded a commercial airplane, threatened to blow it up, demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes, then disappeared into the night after jumping from the aircraft. He left behind almost nothing that could identify him. No body, no confirmed identity, no confession, and no definitive answer about whether he even survived. But there is one detail that makes the mystery even more fascinating. DNA was recovered from an object Cooper left behind. And while that DNA has been used to eliminate at least one major suspect, it has never officially confirmed the identity of the hijacker. So if you've heard that DNA has finally proved who D.B. Cooper was, the real story is more complicated and arguably even stranger. It began on November 24, 1971. A man calling himself Dan Cooper walked into the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter in Portland, Oregon. He purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle. Nothing about him immediately suggested that history was about to remember him. He appeared to be a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a business suit, white shirt, and black tie. He ordered a bourbon and soda and quietly took his seat aboard Flight 305. Then, shortly after takeoff, everything changed. Cooper handed a flight attendant a note. At first, she reportedly put it away without reading it. Cooper leaned closer and made sure she understood that the message was serious. He claimed he had a bomb. When he opened his briefcase, the flight attendant saw what appeared to be wires and red-colored sticks. Whether the device was actually functional has never been established with certainty, but Cooper's demands were clear. He wanted 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills. The plane landed in Seattle. Passengers were released in exchange for the ransom and parachutes. But Cooper kept several members of the crew aboard and ordered the pilots to take off again. His destination was supposed to be Mexico City. He never got there. Sometime after 8 p.m., somewhere between Seattle and Reno, Cooper went to the rear of the aircraft. He attached the ransom money to himself, put on a parachute, and opened the rear stairs. Then he jumped and vanished. The FBI launched one of the most extensive investigations in its history. Thousands of leads were investigated. Hundreds of suspects were examined. Investigators searched for evidence, questioned witnesses, and reconstructed the flight path. But Cooper seemed to disappear from the earth. There was one particularly strange piece of evidence. Before jumping, Cooper had removed his black clip-on tie and left it behind on the airplane. Investigators eventually recovered DNA from that tie. According to the FBI, the tie provided a DNA sample. For a case that had almost no physical evidence, this looked like the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. But there was a problem. The DNA was only a partial profile, and investigators could not establish with certainty that every biological trace on the tie actually belonged to Cooper. That distinction became extremely important. In 2001, the FBI extracted a DNA sample from the tie. By 2007, investigators were publicly discussing the possibility that new technology might help identify the hijacker. But the profile did not produce a definitive match to a suspect. And that is where one of the biggest myths surrounding the case begins. Over the years, several men were publicly identified as possible D.B. Cooper. One of the most famous was Dwayne Weber. Weber reportedly claimed on his deathbed that he was D.B. Cooper. His confession generated enormous interest. If he really was Cooper, the mystery could finally have been over. But DNA testing said otherwise. The FBI reported that a DNA sample obtained from the Cooper tie ruled Weber out. That result was important, but it didn't identify Cooper. It only told investigators that one particular suspect wasn't the man they were looking for. Another famous suspect was Richard Floyd McCoy, a man who committed a remarkably similar airplane hijacking only months after Cooper disappeared. McCoy was an experienced parachutist, and the similarities were so striking that many people believed he had to be Cooper. But investigators ruled him out for several reasons, including differences between his appearance and the descriptions provided by Cooper's flight attendants. Then there was Kenneth Christensen, another popular suspect whose story attracted attention. But once again, the evidence didn't provide the definitive answer. And that is the frustrating part of the Cooper mystery. There are plenty of suspects. There are theories. There are confessions. There are coincidences. There is even DNA. But there is still no scientifically established identification of D.B. Cooper. So what exactly did the DNA reveal? It revealed something fascinating. The FBI had a biological clue connected to an object Cooper almost certainly handled or wore. But because the DNA profile was partial and investigators could not conclusively establish its source, it couldn't simply be entered into a database and produce a name. DNA isn't magic. It doesn't automatically tell investigators who touched an object. It tells investigators what biological material is present and, depending on the quality of the sample, can potentially provide a genetic profile that can be compared against another known individual. In Cooper's case, the comparison problem was enormous. There was no confirmed Cooper reference sample. There was no body. There was no confirmed family relationship. And there was no definitive suspect. So the DNA became a piece of the puzzle rather than the final answer. Then there was another discovery that complicated the story even further. In 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was playing along the Columbia River when he discovered deteriorated packets of $20 bills buried in the sand. The serial numbers matched money from Cooper's ransom. The total was $5,800. That discovery became one of the most important physical clues in the entire investigation. But it created another mystery. If Cooper had survived and escaped successfully, how did part of his ransom end up buried along the river? Did he lose the money? Did someone else find it? Did Cooper die during the jump? Or did he survive and somehow lose part of the ransom afterward? Nobody knows. And there's a reason the survival question remains so important. Cooper jumped into darkness. The weather was poor. The terrain below was heavily wooded. He was not wearing clothing or footwear particularly suited for surviving a rough landing. And investigators eventually concluded that Cooper may not have been the experienced parachutist many people initially imagined him to be. The FBI even suggested that he may not have survived the jump. But if he died, where is his body? That question has haunted the case for generations. Because a body could potentially have solved everything. A body could have provided DNA, dental records, fingerprints, personal identification. Instead, nothing definitive was ever recovered. And in 2016, after 45 years of investigation, the FBI officially redirected its resources away from the active case. The Bureau stated that none of the leads or investigative techniques had produced the proof necessary to definitively identify the hijacker. That means the headline "DNA confirms D.B. Cooper's identity after 53 years" needs an important correction. As of now, there is no official DNA confirmation of D.B. Cooper's identity. And that may actually make the story more interesting. Because the DNA did something almost as important. It demonstrated that modern forensic technology could narrow the field, but couldn't magically solve a mystery when the original evidence was incomplete. The tie remains one of the most famous artifacts in the case. And it has generated another intriguing possibility. Investigators found traces of DNA on the tie, but the FBI has never publicly announced that those traces definitively belong to Cooper. That means an unknown person's DNA could potentially have been transferred onto the tie before Cooper ever wore it. In other words, even if scientists eventually produced a perfect genetic profile from a tie, investigators would still need to establish that the DNA actually belonged to the hijacker. That is the difference between DNA evidence and DNA identification. And it is a difference that often disappears in sensational headlines. For decades, amateur investigators have tried to solve the puzzle themselves. Some believe Cooper was a professional parachutist. Others believe he was an ordinary man who had carefully prepared for the crime. Some think he died that night. Others believe he landed safely, changed his appearance, and quietly disappeared into ordinary life. Some suspects have been so convincing that their families have spent years believing their relative was the mysterious hijacker. But one by one, the evidence has failed to produce a definitive answer. Even the name itself is part of the mystery. The hijacker purchased the ticket under the name Dan Cooper. The FBI notes that DB appears to have originated from a media mistake. The man who hijacked the aircraft was not actually known to investigators as DB Cooper at the beginning. So the name attached to one of America's most famous criminals may itself be based on an error. And yet that incorrect name became legendary. DB Cooper became a symbol of the perfect disappearing criminal. A man walks onto a plane. He commits a spectacular crime. He jumps from the aircraft with a parachute and a fortune in cash. And then he simply disappears. No confirmed photograph. No confirmed identity. No confirmed death. No confirmed escape. Just fragments. A ticket. A tie. Parachutes. Ransom money. Witness descriptions. And DNA. The FBI still preserves evidence from the case, including the material gathered during the investigation. The Bureau has stated that if specific physical evidence related to the parachutes or ransom money ever emerges, it can still be submitted to the FBI. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about this story. After more than half a century, DB Cooper hasn't been officially identified. The DNA didn't give investigators the name everyone wanted. Instead, it gave them another piece of a puzzle that remains unfinished. Maybe one day, advances in genetic genealogy will make it possible to connect the partial profile to a family line. Maybe another piece of evidence will appear. Maybe the ransom money will reveal another clue. Or maybe Cooper really did die somewhere beneath the dark forests of the Pacific Northwest, leaving nothing behind except the money later discovered along the river. But there is another possibility. Maybe he survived. Maybe he walked away from that parachute landing, changed his name, went home, and lived an ordinary life. Maybe somewhere, a family spent decades believing their father or grandfather was simply a quiet man who never talked about the strangest night of his life. And if that is true, then the ultimate mystery isn't simply who DB Cooper was. It's how someone could commit one of the most audacious crimes in American history, and then spend the rest of his life making sure nobody ever found out. For now, despite the headlines, the official evidence does not confirm a definitive identity. The FBI itself continues to describe the hijacker as unknown. The DNA is real. The tie is real. The ransom money is real. The hijacking is real. But the man behind the name remains a mystery. And after 53 years, that may be the strangest revelation of all.